Now we move southwards into Central America, and we spend 2 lectures describing Mesoamerican civilization. You'll recall that I define Mesoamerica as that area of Central America, both lowland and highland, where civilizations arose in pre-Columbian America. I'm going to describe Mesoamerican civilization in 2 parts. Lecture 32, this one, describes the lowland states, principally Maya civilization, while Lecture 33 examines civilization in the highlands, culminating with the magnificent Aztec civilization. In this lecture, we'll begin by describing the ancient roots of lowland civilization in the Olmec cultures of the Gulf lowlands. We examine the distinctive institutions, art styles, and religious beliefs which were the Olmec legacy to Mesoamerican civilization. Next, we'll analyze the origins of ancient Maya civilization and the institution of Maya kingship, which was central to this society. We describe the first great Maya centers at Nacme and El Mirador, then classic Maya civilization with its competing city-states and dynasties of powerful rulers. We'll concentrate on the major kingdoms and show how Maya society came under major stress in the late 1st millennium AD. And then finally, we'll discuss the causes of the ancient Maya collapse in about AD 900. We should stress this wasn't a total collapse, it was a collapse in the southern highlands. In the northern, southern lowlands. In the northern lowlands, Maya civilization continued right up to Spanish conquest and beyond. The origins of Mesoamerican civilization date to the remote past, to a time when maize and bean farmers flourished over a wide area of the highlands and lowlands of Central America. The Mesoamerican highlands are defined by 2 great mountain chains which run down the coastlines of Central America until they reach the east-west volcanic chain, the Mesa Central, which forms the Central Plateau. The inland basin of the Valley of Mexico, with its 5 lakes, was the heart of the highlands, for thousands of years the center of economic and political life. The low-lying limestone peninsula of the Yucatan, with its dense tropical rainforest, forms the heart of the Mesoamerican lowlands, also defined by the low-lying, hot Veracruz and Tabasco coastal plains, and by the heavily forested coastal strip along the Gulf of Honduras. I repeat, in this lecture, we're going to talk about lowland Mesoamerican civilization, and then in the next one, we'll move up on the highlands. But we begin with some commonalities. By 2000 BC, sedentary farming villages were commonplace throughout Mesoamerica. The farmers of the tropical lowlands used slash-and-burn agriculture to cultivate soils of only low to moderate fertility. But in swampy areas, they also developed small areas of raised fields, the predecessors of more extensive field systems in later Maya times. Here, as in other parts of the world, the very diversity of the Mesoamerican lowland environment made everybody dependent on neighbors near and far, living in different surroundings. And from the earliest times, trade networks linked the lowlands and the highlands in an interdependency, which was one of the persistent themes of Mesoamerican civilization. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, the egalitarian societies of earlier times were giving way to much more elaborate societies in which ritual and social ranking played an increasingly important part. Ritual and social ranking, the engines which drove much of Mesoamerican civilization. There was an emerging ideology of chieftainship, in which control of trade in exotic items like tropical bird feathers and obsidian, that's volcanic glass, and a knowledge of distant lands and markets were vital to an emerging ideology of chieftainship, to an ideology that was just as important as it was in other parts of the world, like Egypt. These general developments took place in many areas of the highlands and lowlands, but by far the most famous of these early, emerging, more complex societies was that of the Olmec. The Olmec occupied a revered place in the legend and lore of later Mesoamerican civilizations. Maya priests and lords recognized the profound cultural legacy that they owed to these ancestral Mesoamericans. So did the Aztecs of the highlands, whose rain god Tlaloc may have originated among the primordial deities of the Olmec. Earlier generations of scholars thought of the Olmec as a sort of mother civilization for Mesoamerica, the ancestor of all later civilizations in the region. This was a simplistic model, perhaps appropriate at a time when we knew so much less about Maya civilization than we do now, or about the civilizations in the highlands, and it dates from a time before the decipherment of Maya glyphs, which have thrown so much light on this society. Today, we know that Olmec, in fact, was a series of powerful chiefdoms along the Veracruz and Tabasco coasts, which may have influenced adjacent areas very considerably. Now, Olmec societies flourished in a time when art motifs, religious symbols, and ritual beliefs were shared among chiefdoms in many different regions. Why? As a result of constant contacts between kin leaders and regular exchange and trading activity. Indeed, Olmec art and artifacts have been found over an area 20 times that of the core Olmec region. They've even been found in pre-Maya burials under the great Maya city of Copan in Honduras, a long way away. What do we know archaeologically about the Olmec? We know that they lived along the Mexican South Gulf Coast between about 1500 and 500 BC in a low-lying tropical homeland, rich in animals and plant foods. The birds, fish, and land animals of the forest soon formed an important part of a remarkably sophisticated art style, which was to leave a permanent imprint on Mesoamerican life. Both the beliefs and the art which depicted these animals and plants had ancient indigenous roots. They were one of the foundations of an ideology that gave animals personality, that created deities that were half human and half animals. By 1250 BC, the people of San Lorenzo in the Veracruz region lived on an earthen platform set in the midst of swampy terrain. Soon, their leaders of these people erected platforms and plazas around the platform where they lived. A century later, they began erecting monumental portraits of themselves, huge scowling faces snarling with contemptuous expressions, clearly portraits of rulers. But here was a setting of pyramids and plazas, a setting for public performance of ritual, a persistent theme in later Mesoamerican civilization. Another Olmec site, La Venta, close to the Gulf Coast in the same general region, rose on an island in a swamp, with mounds forming, or delineating, should we say, a rectangular plaza. Here again, huge sculptures depict rulers with expressions of contempt. Nearby are throne-like stone blocks, which show seated figures, perhaps rulers, and often also jaguars, because the power of the jaguar, the forest beast, the dangerous tiger, or the dangerous carnivore, I should say, was definitely associated with shamanship and rulership. These sculptures show us that the institution of kingship arose among the Maya and had much earlier roots. It's known to us from these distinctive Olmec art styles centered on a half-jaguar, half-human figure. The transformation of a human as a shaman from human into supernatural beast. The jaguar symbolized rain and fertility and the power of shamans in ancient Mesoamerican society. The Olmec grafted this ancient ideology of the jaguar onto new ideas about kingship, whereby the king was a shaman ruler with awesome supernatural powers. And right from the beginning of this society, powerful shamanistic rituals involving hallucinogens, the ritual spilling of blood, and public ceremonies of bloodletting, as well probably as human sacrifice, became dominant themes that were to be dominant in later Mesoamerican civilization. The Olmec traditions of civilization were diverse. They had their home in many different chiefdoms, but they crystallized into a variety of flamboyant and brilliant later civilizations. And the best known, and perhaps the most fascinating of all of them, is the civilization of the ancient Maya. A civilization which was discovered by an American traveler, John Lloyd Stevens, and revealed to an astonished world in 1841. A civilization which had never been completely forgotten by the people who created it, whose descendants still live in the rainforest to this day. But a civilization that archaeologically was explored for a century or so before the decipherment of Maya glyphs in the 1970s and 80s have completely transformed our understanding of this most complex and flamboyant society. Ancient Maya civilization originated among humble village communities in the densely forested lowlands, sometime during the second millennium BC. Over the centuries, some Maya communities came under the rule of important kin leaders who controlled trade and ritual life. During the first millennium BC, as Olmec itself was beginning to go into decline, Maya society rapidly developed into a series of competing small city-states. Right from the beginning, these states centered on large ceremonial centers. Two early examples arose in the southern Yucatan, at Nacpi and El Mirador. Now, Nacpi in particular was very important. It reached the height of its importance between 650 and 300 BC, long before the classic Maya civilization of the first millennium AD. But right from the beginning, this center, this city, it was nothing less, was a sacred place of pyramids and platforms and plazas, a setting for ceremonies, a symbolic depiction of the cosmos, was adorned with carvings of the Maya god celestial bird, and with all kinds of symbols, not writing, but symbols of an emerging Maya kingship. There was the beginnings of an emergence of lords who were shamans and rulers. El Mirador had better water supplies than Nacpi, which was 8.5 miles away. Nacpi was slightly earlier, and as it faded, so El Mirador grew into a city covering 6 square miles. A huge complex of pyramids, temples, and plazas, with the largest pyramid rising more than 210 feet above the plain. Surrounded by intensive agricultural activity, Between 150 BC and AD 50, El Mirador became the most powerful of all Maya city-states. And then suddenly, it collapsed. This sudden decline, this volatility, is one of the most marked features of Maya civilization. It was never a stable civilization that lasted for centuries without dramatic shifts like that, say, of the Egyptians. It was a society made up of city-states, just like ancient Sumeria was. And these city-states were constantly interacting and fighting and quarreling. And really, literally within a generation, a city could collapse and a neighbor would come into prosperity. And for some reason or other, and it may have just simply been the exhausting of the agricultural soils around El Mirador, it suddenly collapsed. It was a pre-classic Maya city, a magnificent place still being excavated. One of the problems with the archaeology of the Maya is that the scale of these cities is so large that it takes years and years and large teams of archaeologists to investigate even a small part of the cities, largely because they're overgrown with dense forest. The institution of kingship was at the very heart of Maya civilization. Maya rulers linked their deeds to those of gods and ancestors. And just a simple look at the cities shows us how society was embedded in a matrix of sacred space and time. We know from decipherment of the scripts that the Maya maintained both a secular and a religious calendar, the secular calendar concerned with the cycles of the agricultural year. And an elaborate script helped define Maya kingship and civilization itself. As El Mirador collapsed rapidly, Tikal, one of the great Maya cities, and nearby Huaxtan, stepped into the economic and political vacuum. And with this event, the classic period of Maya civilization began, lasting from about AD 300 to 900. Tikal itself had begun as a small village in 600 BC. By the 2nd century AD, more than 40,000 people lived in or around the urban core of Tikal, with its elaborate complex of more than 100 buildings. The great plaza itself, which has now been partially reconstructed and cleared, with its plastered surface, was the setting for public ceremonies conducted on the surrounding pyramids. These were seen as sacred mountains topped by small temples, whose open doorways were gateways to the other world, to the layered cosmos of the Maya. This entire city and all Maya cities were symbolic models of the cosmos, of a land of trees and lakes and sacred mountains. And the temple doorways at the top of the sacred mountains were the entrance to the other world. And it was through this entrance that a Maya lord in trance would pass and fly freely in the supernatural world. Tikal's ruling dynasty was founded in AD 219. We know this from inscriptions at the site. And they've managed to reconstruct the dynasty's rulers. 39 of them inherited Tikal's throne over more than 600 years. Now, the continuity here was based on genealogy, on succession and relationship to divine ancestors. Here, as with other civilizations, there was a pinnacle at the top of the ruler and priests and high nobles and a nobility, and below them the pyramid of subsistence farmers. The many served the few. Great public ceremonies set in the heart of this symbolic world validated the contract between the ruler and the ancestors and the ruler and the people, so that the royal ancestor ensured the perpetuation of life and the placation of the forces of the supernatural world. The history of the Tikal dynasty is truly remarkable. In AD 378, Lord Great Jaguar defeated Wakhtagtun and dismantled Tikal's rival. The expanded kingdom prospered, reaching its height in the 6th century, when its territory covered nearly 1,000 square miles. Small by the standards of Egypt or Han China, but it was a city-state, because you see, classic Maya civilization was a patchwork. It was a maze of competing states who went through these endless cycles of rise and fall, of collapse and renewed prosperity. The same old game of the concertina. And inevitably, there was expansion on the margins of polities like Tikal, where new states rose and fell as the core prospered or became weak. Such volatility was not unique to the Maya. As we shall see, it was an enduring feature of Mesoamerican civilization on the highlands and generally. There were other Mesoamerican Maya city-states which also achieved great prominence. Among them Calakmul in the southern lowlands, a major center linked to its subordinate towns and centers by raised roads through the surrounding swamplands. Palenque, in the foothills of the Sierra of Chiapas, is famous for its architecture and for the Lord Pakal shield, who reigned for 67 years in the 7th and 8th centuries AD. In one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries ever made in Mexico, a Mexican archaeologist, Miguel Ruz, found the tomb of Pakal. He happened to see some loose paving stones in the floor of the temple of the inscription on top of the pyramid of that name. He removed them and found a rubble-filled passageway and staircase. It took him 2 months to clear it, and down at the bottom was a burial chamber, and in it a sarcophagus covered with a magnificent stone covered with glyphs, which we now know recorded the genealogy and the divine ancestors of Pakal. Inside was the skeleton of the man wearing a magnificent jade mask. So the glyphs and the archaeology coincided. Another great city was Copan in modern-day Honduras, which boasted an elaborate complex of enclosed courtyards, pyramids and temples, where successive rulers built their architectural statements on top of their predecessors, like this. Between 435 and 800, a powerful dynasty ruled the city and the surrounding hinterland. But by the 8th century, Copan and other Maya city-states were in trouble. The population had risen. The largest cities were top-heavy with an expanding nobility. And this nobility made constant and insatiable demands for labor, food, and prestigious objects, which put a severe stress on the rural population of commoners. And on top of all this, elsewhere in the southern lowlands, Maya farming was in trouble. Now, you must understand the dynamics of agriculture in this area, which are distinctive and actually were quite high risk. For years, people puzzled over how the Maya managed to support such enormous cities in an environment where apparently people lived by simple slash and burn agriculture, the sort of agriculture we talked about with the band Ceramic of Europe, where the soils were very vulnerable to erosion, could form into a cemented hard pack when cleared, and were very easily destroyed by heavy rainfall. Their fertility, in any case, was low. We found out in the 1960s and 70s that the Maya had turned to hillside terracing and to a large-scale schemes of swamp gardens irrigated with canals to feed a rapidly rising population. But these swamp gardens, which were highly productive, were fine. But there was another factor in all this, apart from the fact that the carrying capacity of most of the land was very low. And that was that the Maya lowlands were very vulnerable to drought. We know about these droughts by recent research into cores drilled into the floors of lakes in the region. And they have shown that Maya civilization reached its peak by AD 600, when the rainfall was plentiful. And then there was a series of prolonged droughts recorded in these lake bed deposits in the 9th century. Now this coincided with what appears to have been a big social crisis in Maya society, a growing nobility, insatiable demands for public buildings, for food, for artworks, more and more trade, higher tribute payments, whatever. At a time when suddenly drought hit in an agricultural system which was stressed to the limit, where many of the fields were already exhausted. At the same time, on top of all this, there was frenzied competition and constant warfare between these neighboring states. And suddenly, in AD 900, classic Maya civilization collapsed in the southern lowlands. How do we know about this? From some remarkable research done at Copan, which has shown that the dense rural population of the dense urban population around AD 900 suddenly began to move out and disperse. And within a century, the city was practically deserted. You see, if you've got a situation where a big city is getting hungry, where there is social unrest, where the superstructure of a civilization is no longer viable, you've only got one strategy, rather like Chaco Canyon. You disperse. And it appears that in these areas, these cities were no longer, in the southern lowlands, were no longer sustainable. So people just simply moved away into the villages and evaporated into the landscape. The great centers were abandoned, public buildings no longer built, inscriptions no longer prepared. The population declined rapidly. Probably there was hunger, there was certainly violence, and the ending was traumatic. But centuries of classic Maya civilization evaporated in the final analysis because the Maya outgrew their environment and were very, very vulnerable to dramatic short-term climate change, quite apart from all the social stresses of a society which was expanding its nobility too fast, where the kings were too remote and disinterested in the day-to-day problems of life in the rainforest. Maya civilization, as I said earlier, continued to flourish in the northern Yucatan until Spanish contact in the 16th century. And the continuity of Maya civilization in many respects still endures today because shamanism is alive and well among the Maya who live in Central America in the 21st century. In this lecture, we've looked at Maya civilization and its beginnings in much humbler farming communities over 3,000 years ago. We described the legacy of the complex Olmec cultures of the Gulf lowlands to Mesoamerican civilization. And then we spent the rest of the lecture looking at some of the major features of Maya civilization. We argued that it was never a large territorial state like that of the Egyptians or the Mauryans. The Maya lacked the organization and military logistics, also the communications to control wide areas and garrison conquered cities. The military and diplomatic landscape ebbed and flowed with the generations in the shifting stands of competition, diplomacy, arranged marriages, and warfare. And then, in the southern lowlands, this stressful tightrope collapsed, and Mayan civilization imploded in the southern lowlands.